The paint was cold on her fingers, and Julia Ashford could not remember the last time she had laughed this hard over something as simple as whitewash dripping from a brush onto a cowboy's boot. The afternoon sun blazed overhead in the Oregon sky, and the fence stretched ahead of them like a white ribbon unfurling across the hillside, and she felt lighter than she had in months, maybe years. Benjamin Shaw stood beside her with his sleeves rolled to his elbows, his hat pushed back on his head, and he was grinning at her like she had just told the finest joke in the world when all she had done was accidentally flick paint across his chest while gesturing too wildly with her brush. The ranch house sat behind them, solid and square against the backdrop of rolling hills that went gold in summer and green in spring, and her mother was inside preparing supper, and everything felt exactly as it should be. Then the sound of hoofbeats broke through their laughter, and Julia looked up to see a figure riding toward them along the dusty road, and her heart clenched with recognition, even before she could make out his face. Marcus Whitley sat astride a fine bay mare, his suit immaculate despite the dust of travel, his dark hair combed back beneath a gentleman's hat that had no place on a working ranch. He had always looked like he belonged in a drawing room rather than under the wide Oregon sky, and seeing him now, after 6 months of silence, made Julia feel as though someone had opened a door into a room she had carefully shut and locked. Benjamin noticed the change in her posture and followed her gaze, his easy smile fading into something more watchful, more careful. Marcus drew his horse to a stop near the fence, and for a moment no one spoke, and Julia became acutely aware of the paint on her hands, and the simple work dress she wore, and the way her hair had come loose from its pins. Marcus dismounted with the practiced grace of a man who had never done a day of hard labor in his life, and he held his hat in his hands like a penitent, and when he spoke, his voice carried all the regret she had once longed to hear. "Julia," he said, and just her name, nothing more, as though it contained everything he needed to say. She set down her paintbrush on the edge of the bucket and wiped her hands on the rag tucked into her apron, aware of Benjamin standing quietly beside her, patient and solid as the fence posts they had been painting all afternoon. Marcus looked between them, and something flickered across his face, surprise perhaps, or uncertainty, and then he focused on Julia again with that earnest expression she remembered too well. "I have come to speak with you if you will permit it. I know I have no right to ask, but I have traveled a long way, and there are things I need to say." His voice was smooth and cultured, the voice of a man who had been educated back east and who had prospects and connections, and everything a practical woman should want. Julia felt Benjamin shift beside her, and she glanced up at him, and he gave her the smallest nod, a gesture that said he would wait, he would give her space, he would not intrude. The generosity of it made her chest ache. "You can speak," she said to Marcus, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. She did not invite him closer, did not move from where she stood beside the fence with paint still drying on the boards and the late afternoon sun turning everything golden. Marcus took a step forward, and another, until only the fence separated them, and she could see the lines of strain around his eyes, the evidence of whatever had brought him back to her door after half a year of nothing. "I made a mistake," he began, and the words tumbled out like he had rehearsed them, like he had been practicing this speech for miles of dusty road. "I was a fool, Julia. I let fear guide me when I should have listened to my heart. My family, they had expectations, plans for me that did not include marrying the daughter of a rancher, and I was weak enough to listen. I thought I could build a life without you, thought I could find someone who fit the mold they wanted, but I have been miserable. Every day I have regretted walking away. I should have fought for you. I should have stood against them and chosen you, and I am here now to ask if you might give me another chance, if we might start again and do it right this time." He said it all with such sincerity, such raw honesty that Julia might have believed him 6 months ago, might have thrown herself into his arms and wept with relief. But 6 months ago she had been a different woman, one who thought love meant waiting for someone to decide you were worth the trouble, worth the fight against family expectations. Now she stood in work clothes with paint on her hands, and beside her was a man who had never once made her feel like she needed to earn his regard, who had spent weeks working alongside her and treating her like she was exactly right just as she was. She looked at Marcus and felt a strange sort of pity because she could see he meant what he said, could see that he genuinely believed coming back would set things right. But he had not asked if she was happy. He had not noticed the way Benjamin stood beside her, quiet and watchful. He had not seen that she was laughing when he rode up, that she was in the middle of a life that did not include him anymore. "I appreciate you coming all this way," Julia said carefully, choosing each word like stepping stones across a creek. "And I believe that you are sorry. But Marcus, you left. You chose your family's approval over me, and that was your right. People make choices and we have to live with them." She saw him open his mouth to protest, to argue, and she held up one paint-streaked hand to stop him. "I am not angry anymore. I was for a while, but that passed. I have moved on with my life, and I am happy. Truly happy. You cannot simply arrive and expect everything to go back to the way it was, because I am not the same person I was when you left, and I do not want what I wanted then." The words felt good to say, felt true, and she realized as she spoke them that she had been carrying this truth inside her for weeks without quite knowing it. Benjamin did not move, did not speak, but she felt his presence like a steady anchor, like he was silently telling her he would support whatever she chose to say, whatever she needed to do. Marcus looked stricken, and then his gaze cut to Benjamin, really seeing him for the first time, and understanding dawned slowly across his face. "I see," he said, and his voice had gone flat, careful. "You have found someone else." It was not quite a question, but Julia heard the hope in it anyway, the desperate wish that she might deny it, might say that Benjamin was just a hired hand, just help around the ranch, nothing more. She could have softened it, could have been vague, but she found she did not want to. She was tired of softening truths to spare other people's feelings. "Benjamin has been helping my family this summer," she said, and she did not elaborate, did not explain the long afternoons working side by side, the conversations that stretched into evenings, the way her heart had quietly, persistently turned toward him like a flower following the sun. Let Marcus draw his own conclusions. Let him see what was plainly in front of him. Benjamin finally spoke, and his voice was low and even, the voice of a man who did not need to prove anything. "Madam, I will leave you two to talk in private if you would prefer." He was already stepping back, already giving her space, and Julia felt a surge of something fierce and protective. No, she did not want him to leave. She did not want Marcus to think for one moment that Benjamin was someone who could be dismissed, sent away while the adults talked. "Stay," she said, and it came out more forceful than she intended. She turned to look at Benjamin fully, and his hazel eyes met hers with that quiet steadiness she had come to rely on, and she softened her voice. "Please stay. There is nothing Marcus needs to say that cannot be said in front of you." It was a declaration, and she saw Benjamin understand it as such, saw something flicker in his expression, something warm and wondering that made her pulse quicken. Marcus cleared his throat, drawing her attention back, and she could see he was struggling to maintain his composure, to keep playing the role of the penitent suitor when what he wanted was to demand, to insist, to exercise some claim he thought he still held. Julia, I am asking you to consider what I am offering. I have a position now with my father's firm. I can provide for you, give you a life of comfort and respectability. Your mother wants this for you, wants to see you settled well. I spoke with her before I came here, and she is willing to support a renewal of our courtship. Surely that must mean something. He was pulling out every argument he had, every practical reason why she should choose him, and Julia felt her temper stir. Her mother. Of course her mother had spoken with him, had likely encouraged him, had seen in his return a chance to restore the social standing that had been damaged when Marcus broke their engagement. My mother does not speak for me, Julia said, and her voice had gone sharp. She wants security and status, and I understand that, I do. But those are not the things that matter most to me, Marcus. They never were, really, though I tried to convince myself otherwise when we were together. She took a breath, steadying herself, and Benjamin shifted slightly closer, not touching her but near enough that she could feel the warmth of him, the solid reality of his support. You are offering me a life that looks good on paper, that would make sense to everyone who knows us. But I do not want a life that makes sense. I want a life that makes me happy, and those are not the same thing. She saw Marcus flinch, saw him realize that he was losing this, that his carefully prepared speech and his promises of comfort were not going to be enough. Part of her ached for him, for the pain he was feeling, but a larger part of her felt relieved, felt free, felt like she was finally saying the things she should have said months ago instead of quietly accepting his decision and nursing her hurt in private. Is it him? Marcus asked, and now there was an edge to his voice, a sharpness that made Benjamin go very still beside her. Is this about him, or is it truly about me? Because if you are simply trying to punish me, trying to make me feel what you felt when I left, then, Julia cut him off, her own anger rising to meet his. This is not about punishing you, Marcus. This is about me finally understanding what I want and what I deserve. Yes, I have feelings for Benjamin. Yes, I would choose him over you, and not because I am trying to hurt you, but because he has shown me what it feels like to be valued exactly as I am, without conditions, without needing to change or fit some idea of what I should be. She was breathing hard now, her hands clenched at her sides, and she could feel the paint drying stiff on her fingers, could smell the sharp tang of it mixing with the dust and the grass, and the clean scent of the wind coming down from the hills. Marcus stared at her for a long moment, and she watched emotions play across his face. Shock, hurt, anger, and finally a bitter sort of resignation. I see I have wasted my time, he said stiffly, and he turned back toward his horse, his movements jerky with suppressed feeling. Julia felt a pang of guilt, but she did not call him back, did not soften her words. Sometimes kindness looked like letting someone go, like refusing to give them false hope just to ease the immediate pain. Marcus mounted his horse, and he looked down at her from that height, and for a moment she thought he might say something else, might make one last appeal. But then he simply touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was more habit than courtesy, and turned his horse back toward the road. She watched him ride away, watched the dust rise behind him, and she felt Benjamin standing close behind her now, his presence a question he was too careful to ask aloud. When Marcus was nothing but a distant figure on the road, Julia finally turned to face Benjamin, and the look on his face made her breath catch. He was watching her with an expression that was part wonder, part wariness, like he was afraid to believe what he had just heard but wanted desperately to hope. "Did you mean that?" he asked quietly, and his voice had gone rough. "What you said about me?" Julia felt suddenly shy, felt the weight of what she had just declared settling over her like a cloak. It was one thing to say those words in the heat of the moment, to use them as a shield against Marcus's entreaties. It was another thing entirely to stand here in the golden afternoon light and admit them directly to the man they concerned. But she had not come this far, had not found this much courage, only to lose her nerve now. "Yes," she said simply. "I meant every word." She took a step closer to him, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his hazel eyes, close enough to notice the way his throat worked as he swallowed hard. "I have been falling for you for weeks now, Benjamin. Maybe longer. I just did not let myself acknowledge it because it seemed foolish, seemed like I was setting myself up to be hurt again. But when Marcus rode up today, when I saw him standing there asking for another chance, all I could think was that I did not want him. I wanted to get back to painting the fence with you. I wanted to hear you laugh. I wanted this, whatever this is between us, and I did not want anything to take it away." The words poured out of her in a rush, clumsy and earnest, and she watched Benjamin's face transform as he listened, watched the wariness give way to something bright and fierce. "Julia," he said, and his voice was barely above a whisper. "I have been in love with you since the first week I came to work here. I have been trying to keep it to myself, trying not to overstep, because I am just a ranch hand and you are the rancher's daughter, and I know how these things work. I know what people expect, what your family wants for you. And when that man rode up today, looking like he walked out of a photograph, I thought—" He broke off, shaking his head, and Julia reached out and caught his hand, her fingers threading through his, paint and all. "I thought you would choose him," Benjamin finished quietly. "I thought I would have to stand here and watch you ride away with someone who could give you everything I cannot, and I did not know if I could bear it. But then you said those things, and you looked at me like I mattered more than all his fine promises, and I swear my heart nearly stopped." Julia tightened her grip on his hand, and she felt tears pricking at her eyes, but they were good tears, the kind that came from relief and joy rather than sorrow. "You matter more," she said fiercely. "You matter more than his promises, more than my mother's expectations, more than what makes sense on paper. You matter because you make me laugh, because you work beside me like I am your equal, because you have never once made me feel like I need to be someone different to earn your regard. Do you understand? You are not less than him, Benjamin. You are more in every way that counts." She saw him blink hard, saw him struggling with emotion, and then he lifted his free hand and cupped her cheek gently, his palm warm and rough from work. "I do not have much to offer you," he said, and his voice was unsteady. "I have a horse, my skills, and whatever wages I can earn. I cannot give you the kind of life he was promising, the comfort and the status. But I can promise you that I will spend every day trying to make you happy, trying to be worthy of what you are offering me." "You already make me happy," Julia said, and she leaned into his touch, closing her eyes for just a moment to savor the feel of his hand against her skin. "And you are already worthy, Benjamin Shaw. You have been worthy from the start. I just needed time to realize it." When she opened her eyes again, he was looking at her with such open adoration that it made her chest ache. Slowly, carefully, like he was afraid she might startle or change her mind, he leaned down and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, tentative and sweet, and Julia felt something inside her settle and sigh with contentment, like a piece of herself she had not known was missing had finally clicked into place. When they pulled apart, Benjamin was smiling, that easy, warm smile she had come to love, and he glanced down at their joined hands, at the paint still drying on her fingers. "We should probably finish that fence," he said, and there was laughter in his voice, and Julia laughed too, the sound bright and free in the afternoon air. "Yes," she agreed, "we probably should." But neither of them moved for a long moment, too caught up in the newness of this thing between them, too busy grinning at each other like fools. Finally, Benjamin stepped back, though he kept hold of her hand for a beat longer. And then he let go and picked up his paintbrush, and they returned to work side by side, the silence between them now comfortable and full of promise. Julia found herself sneaking glances at him as they painted, found herself marveling at how different she felt now compared to an hour ago, how the simple act of naming what she wanted had shifted everything into sharper focus. The fence stretched ahead of them, half-painted and gleaming white in the sun, and she thought about how fitting it was, painting something new over something old, making it fresh and clean and ready for whatever came next. The sun was lower in the sky by the time they finished, long shadows stretching across the grass, and Julia's arms ached pleasantly from the work. Benjamin stood back to survey their efforts, hands on his hips, and nodded with satisfaction. "That is a fine-looking fence," he said, and Julia laughed, because it was just a fence, nothing special, but somehow it felt significant, like they had built something together that mattered. They carried the paint buckets and brushes back toward the barn, and Julia was acutely aware of how close Benjamin walked beside her, how their shoulders brushed occasionally, how the air between them seemed charged with possibility. As they rounded the corner of the barn, they nearly collided with Julia's mother, who was standing with her arms crossed and a pinched expression on her face that Julia knew all too well. Margaret Ashford was a handsome woman in her late 40s, her dark hair streaked with silver, her posture ramrod straight from years of running a household and managing a ranch. She looked at Julia and then at Benjamin, and her lips thinned with disapproval. "Julia, I need to speak with you," Margaret said, and her tone brooked no argument. "Privately." Julia felt Benjamin tense beside her, and she fought the urge to reach for his hand again, to make some gesture of solidarity that would announce her intentions before she had even had a chance to talk with her mother properly. Instead, she nodded and set down her paint bucket, and she followed her mother into the house, into the sitting room with its stiff furniture and heavy curtains that always made the space feel smaller than it was. Margaret closed the door behind them with a decisive click, and then she turned to face Julia with her arms still crossed, her expression a mix of frustration and concern. "Marcus Whitley rode through here earlier, and he looked devastated," Margaret began without preamble. "He told me that you refused him, that you have formed an attachment to the hired man. Please tell me he was exaggerating, that he misunderstood the situation." Julia felt her spine straighten, felt the same determination that had carried her through the confrontation with Marcus rise up again. "He did not misunderstand," she said evenly. "I did refuse him, and yes, I have feelings for Benjamin, strong feelings. And before you tell me that I am being foolish, that I am throwing away a good opportunity, I need you to hear me, Mother. I do not love Marcus. I'm not sure I ever truly did. What I felt for him was more about wanting to please you, wanting to make a match that made sense, than about any real affection between us. And he proved that he did not value me enough to fight for me when it mattered. Why would I want to tie myself to a man like that?" Margaret's expression flickered, something that might have been understanding crossing her face before she schooled it back into firmness. "Because, Julia, love is not the only thing that sustains a marriage. Practical considerations matter. Security matters. Marcus can provide for you in ways that a drifting cowboy cannot. I know you are young and romantic, and I know that Benjamin Shaw seems charming, but what happens when the romance fades and you are left trying to make ends meet on a ranch hand's wages?" "Benjamin is not a drifting cowboy," Julia said, and she could not keep the heat out of her voice. "He is a good, honest man who works hard and treats people with respect. And as for security, I would rather struggle with someone I love than live comfortably with someone I do not. You cannot ask me to choose a life of ease over a life of happiness, Mother," That is not fair, and it is not right." She saw her mother's jaw tighten, saw the struggle playing out in her eyes, and she softened her tone slightly, trying to reach the woman beneath the practical exterior. "I know you worry about me. I know you want me to be taken care of. But I am not a child anymore, and I need to make my own choices, even if they are not the choices you would make. Benjamin makes me happy. He makes me laugh. He sees me, really sees me in a way Marcus never did. Please, Mother, do not ask me to give that up." Margaret was silent for a long moment, her gaze searching Julia's face, and then she sighed, a long, weary sound that seemed to carry years of worry and resignation. "You are so much like your father," she said quietly, and for the first time her voice held no anger, only a tired sort of affection. "He was impractical too, always chasing what made him happy instead of what made sense. He brought me out here to this ranch when I was your age, promising me adventure and freedom, and I followed him because I loved him, even though my own mother warned me I would regret it. And there were hard times, Julia. There were years when I wondered if we would make it, when I lay awake at night worrying about money and drought and 100 other things. But he never stopped making me laugh, never stopped looking at me like I was the most important thing in his world, and in the end I have never regretted it, not once." She paused, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "If you truly believe that Benjamin can give you what your father gave me, then I will not stand in your way. But you need to be certain, Julia. You need to be sure that this is not just a reaction to being hurt by Marcus, that you are not simply choosing the opposite of what you had before." Julia felt her own eyes sting, felt the weight of her mother's unexpected vulnerability. She thought about what she had said to Marcus, about the weeks of quiet falling that had preceded his arrival, about the way her heart had turned toward Benjamin without any grand drama or sudden realization. "I am sure," she said softly, "this is not about Marcus, not really. This is about me finally understanding what I want, and Benjamin is what I want. He has been what I wanted for a while now, I think. I was just too afraid to admit it, too afraid of being wrong again. But I am not wrong, Mother. I know it in my bones." Margaret nodded slowly, and then she crossed the space between them and pulled Julia into a hug, and Julia leaned into her mother's embrace, breathing in the familiar scent of lavender and starch. "Then I will trust your judgment," Margaret murmured against her hair. "But if he breaks your heart, I will have words with him. Strong words." Julia laughed despite herself, and she pulled back to look at her mother's face, saw the reluctant acceptance there, the love that underlay all the worry and practicality. "He will not break my heart," Julia said with conviction. "I trust him." Margaret patted her cheek gently, and then she stepped back and straightened her skirts, composing herself back into the capable, no-nonsense woman she usually presented to the world. "Well then, I suppose we had better set an extra place for supper. If Benjamin Shaw is going to be courting my daughter properly, he should at least sit at our table and let us get to know him." It was an olive branch, and Julia seized it gratefully, smiling so wide her face hurt. "Thank you, Mother." "Truly." Margaret waved a hand dismissively, but Julia could see the softness in her eyes, the way her mother was already mentally rearranging her expectations to make room for this new reality. They returned to the kitchen together, and Julia helped her mother finish preparing the meal, and when her father came in from the far pasture with the sun setting behind him, Margaret took him aside and spoke to him in low tones while Julia pretended not to listen. Thomas Ashford was a broad-shouldered man with sun-weathered skin and kind eyes, and when he looked at Julia across the kitchen, he winked at her, and she knew that her mother had told him everything and that he, at least, was not going to be an obstacle. Benjamin came to supper washed and presentable, his hair still damp, his manner polite and a little nervous as Thomas invited him to sit at the table with the family. The meal started quietly, everyone feeling their way through the new dynamics, but gradually conversation began to flow, and Julia watched with a mix of relief and pride as Benjamin spoke easily with her father about ranch work, about the best way to manage the herd through the coming winter, about repairs that needed doing before the autumn rains began. He did not try to impress or to put on airs. He was simply himself, competent and thoughtful and quick to smile, and Julia saw her father warming to him, saw the way Thomas nodded approvingly at Benjamin's comments. Margaret was more reserved, but even she seemed to unbend slightly as the evening wore on, and by the time they finished eating, the atmosphere around the table felt almost companionable. When Benjamin finally took his leave, thanking her parents for their hospitality, Julia walked with him out to the porch, and they stood together in the cool evening air, watching the stars begin to emerge overhead. "That went better than I expected," Benjamin said, and there was relief in his voice. "I thought your mother might order me off the property." Julia laughed softly. "She considered it," she admitted, "but I convinced her that I knew what I was doing, and my father likes you. I could tell." Benjamin turned to face her, and in the dim light from the house his eyes were very serious. "Julia, I know we need to take this slowly to do things properly, but I want you to know that my intentions are serious. I am not playing games or looking for a passing fancy. When I said I loved you, I meant it with everything I have. I want to build a life with you if you will have me." Julia felt her breath catch, felt the enormity of what he was offering settle over her like a blanket, warm and secure. "I want that too," she said, and she reached out to take his hand again, lacing her fingers through his. "I want all of it, Benjamin. The life, the partnership, all of it." He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently, a gesture that was both old-fashioned and deeply sweet, and then he smiled at her, that easy smile that made her heart do foolish things in her chest. "Then I will do everything in my power to make it happen," he said quietly. "Starting with courting you properly, with your parents' blessing, and doing this the right way." Julia wanted to protest that they did not need to follow all the old rules, that they had already declared themselves to each other, and that should be enough. But she saw the importance of it in his eyes, the way he wanted to honor her and her family by doing things correctly, and she found she did not mind the formality of it, the ritual of courtship. There was something reassuring about it, something that said he was committed to seeing this through, no matter how long it took. She nodded, and he squeezed her hand once more before letting go and stepping back, and she watched him walk toward the bunkhouse where he stayed with the other ranch hands, his silhouette dark against the starlit sky. The weeks that followed took on a different quality, shot through with a sweetness Julia had never experienced before. Benjamin courted her properly, asking her father's permission to call on her, bringing her small gifts, wildflowers he picked on the range, a carved wooden bird he made in the evenings, and spending time with her family so that they could all grow comfortable with the idea of him as Julia's chosen partner. They still worked together on the ranch, but now there was an acknowledgement between them, a promise hanging in the air that made even the mundane tasks feel charged with meaning. They mended fences together, rode out to check on the cattle, helped her father with the endless chores that came with running a ranch, and through it all they talked, long, rambling conversations that covered everything from their childhoods to their dreams for the future. Julia learned that Benjamin had grown up in Wyoming, that his father had died when he was young and his mother had remarried, that he had been working on ranches since he was 14 to help support his family. He spoke of wanting his own place someday, a small spread where he could raise good horses, maybe some cattle, and live the kind of life where he was his own master. Julia shared her own hopes, the way she had always loved the ranch but had never felt like it was truly hers, the way she had thought marrying Marcus would give her a place and a purpose, only to realize that what she really wanted was to build something with someone who saw her as a partner rather than an ornament. As the summer gave way to autumn, the hills around the ranch turned gold and russet, and the air took on a crisp edge that spoke of coming winter. Benjamin had saved every penny of his wages, and one evening in late September, he asked Julia to take a walk with him down to the creek that ran through the property. She went willingly, curious and a little nervous about what he might say, and when they reached the water's edge, he turned to her and took both her hands in his, and his face was solemn and hopeful all at once. "Julia, I know I do not have much," he began, and his voice was steady despite the emotion she could see in his eyes. "I am still just a hired hand, and I cannot offer you the kind of life Marcus could have given you. But I have been saving, and I have spoken with your father about renting a piece of land on the edge of the property, a place where we could build a house, start our own small operation. It would not be much at first, but it would be ours, and I would work every day to make it into something we could be proud of." He paused, swallowing hard, and then he continued, his voice going rough. "What I am trying to ask, and doing a poor job of it, is whether you would marry me, Julia. Whether you would take a chance on building that life with me, even though it will be hard and uncertain and nothing like what you could have had." Julia felt tears spill down her cheeks, but they were joyful tears, and she was smiling so hard she could barely speak. "Yes," she said, and the word came out choked and emphatic. "Yes, Benjamin, of course I will marry you. I do not care that it will be hard. I do not care about certainty or comfort or any of the things I thought I wanted. I just want you, and I want to build something with you, and I cannot think of anything I would rather do with my life." He let out a breath that was half laugh, half sob, and then he pulled her into his arms and held her tightly, and Julia pressed her face against his chest and listened to the steady thud of his heart, and thought that this, right here, was what happiness felt like. When they finally pulled apart, Benjamin reached into his pocket and drew out a simple silver ring set with a small blue stone, and he slipped it onto her finger with shaking hands. "It was my grandmother's," he said quietly. "The only thing of value I have to give you. My mother sent it to me when I wrote to her about you, said that my grandmother would have wanted you to have it." Julia looked down at the ring, at the way it caught the last rays of the setting sun, and she felt a rush of love not just for Benjamin but for the family he came from, for the mother who had sent this precious heirloom to a woman she had never met. "It is perfect," she whispered. "I will treasure it." They walked back to the house hand in hand, and when they told her parents the news, Thomas clapped Benjamin on the shoulder and pulled him into a rough hug, and Margaret wiped at her eyes and declared that they would need to start planning immediately, that there was much to be done before winter set in. Julia caught her mother's eye and saw approval there, saw acceptance, and she felt a weight she had not realized she was carrying finally lift from her shoulders. They were married in late October, on a bright cold day with the leaves falling like gold coins around them. The ceremony was simple, held in the small church in town with only family and a few close friends in attendance. But to Julia, it felt more significant than any grand society wedding could have been. She wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her, and she carried a bouquet of late-blooming wildflowers that Benjamin had picked that morning. When she walked down the aisle on her father's arm and saw Benjamin waiting for her at the altar, his face alight with love and wonder, she felt like the luckiest woman in the world. They spoke their vows clearly, firmly, promising to love and honor each other through whatever trials life might bring. and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Benjamin kissed her with such tenderness that Julia thought her heart might burst. The reception was held back at the ranch, a lively affair with music and dancing and more food than they could possibly eat, and Julia danced with her new husband under the wide Oregon sky and thought that she had never been happier, never felt more certain that she had made the right choice. As the evening wore on and the guests began to drift away, Benjamin led her to the small cabin he had built on the piece of land her father had agreed to rent them, and Julia stepped inside and looked around at the single room with its rough-hewn furniture and stone fireplace, and she felt not disappointment but excitement, anticipation for all the years they would spend filling this space with their lives. That first winter was hard, as Benjamin had warned her it would be. The cabin was drafty, and they had to work constantly to keep the fire going, to keep the cold from seeping through the cracks in the walls. Money was tight, and there were nights when Julia lay awake worrying about whether they would have enough to see them through to spring. But there were also moments of profound joy, mornings when she woke up wrapped in Benjamin's arms and felt so content she could barely breathe, evenings when they sat by the fire and talked or simply enjoyed each other's company in comfortable silence. Benjamin worked tirelessly, taking on extra jobs around the area to supplement what he made from helping on her father's ranch, and Julia worked beside him, learning to manage their small household, to stretch their resources, to find pleasure in the simple things. By the time spring arrived, they had made it through, battered but intact, and Julia felt a fierce pride in what they had survived together. Spring brought new beginnings. The land began to green, and Benjamin used the last of his savings to buy a few head of cattle and some good breeding stock for horses. Julia planted a garden near the cabin, determined to grow as much of their food as she could, and she found a deep satisfaction in working the soil, in watching things grow under her care. They expanded the cabin, adding another room, and Julia began to feel like they were truly building something, creating a home that was theirs in every sense of the word. Her parents visited often, and Thomas gave them advice on managing their small herd, and Margaret brought supplies and helped Julia with the harder tasks. And gradually, the initial strain that had marked the beginning of Julia's relationship with Benjamin eased into something warmer, something that looked like family. By the time summer rolled around again, Julia discovered she was expecting a child, and the news filled her with a mixture of joy and terror. She told Benjamin one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, and he stared at her for a long moment as though he could not quite believe what he was hearing. And then he let out a whoop of delight and picked her up and spun her around until she was laughing and begging him to put her down. The pregnancy was not easy. Julia was sick for the first few months, barely able to keep anything down, and she grew frustrated with her own body, with the way it betrayed her at the most inconvenient times. But Benjamin was endlessly patient, bringing her water and cool cloths, sitting with her when she felt too miserable to do anything but lie in bed, and his steady presence helped her through the worst of it. As the months passed and her belly began to swell, Julia found herself marveling at the life growing inside her, at the tiny kicks and movements that reminded her she was not alone, that she was carrying their future within her. Benjamin talked to her stomach in the evenings, telling their unborn child stories about the ranch, about the horses they would learn to ride, about the life they would build together. And Julia fell in love with him all over again, watching him prepare to be a father. The baby came in late winter, on a night when the wind howled outside and snow piled against the cabin walls. The labor was long and brutal, and there were moments when Julia was certain she could not do it, could not endure another contraction, but her mother was there, and the midwife from town and Benjamin held her hand and whispered encouragement. And finally, as dawn broke over the snowy hills, their daughter was born. They named her Teresa, after Benjamin's grandmother, and Julia held the tiny squirming bundle and felt a love so fierce it frightened her. Teresa had a thatch of dark hair and her father's hazel eyes, and from the first moment she made her presence known with a lusty cry that spoke of strength and determination. Benjamin cried when he held his daughter for the first time, tears streaming down his face as he marveled at the impossibly small fingers, the perfect little face, and Julia watched him and thought that she had been right to choose this life, this man, because this kind of joy could not be bought with money or status or any of the things Marcus had offered. They settled into the rhythms of parenthood, exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure, and Julia learned to function on little sleep, to nurse the baby while managing the household, to find moments of connection with Benjamin in the chaos of their new reality. Teresa thrived, growing fat and happy, and as the months passed she began to smile and then to laugh, and the sound of her joy became the soundtrack to their lives. 2 years later, Julia gave birth to their first son, and they named him Gideon, a strong name for a strong boy who came into the world with a full head of blonde hair and his mother's blue eyes. Teresa was fascinated by her baby brother, toddling over to peer into his cradle and patting his head with surprising gentleness for a child so young. The cabin felt smaller now with 4 of them, and Benjamin began making plans to expand again, to add more rooms so that the children would have space to grow. Money was still tight, but they were managing, their small herd was growing, and Benjamin had earned a reputation in the area as a skilled horseman, someone who could gentle even the wildest Mustang. People began bringing him horses to train, paying him for his time and expertise, and the extra income made a real difference. Julia felt proud of what they had built together, proud of the way Benjamin had turned his skills into a livelihood, proud of their growing family and the life they were carving out of the Oregon wilderness. The years passed in a blur of hard work and small triumphs and the endless demands of raising children. When Teresa was 4 and Gideon was 2, Julia discovered she was pregnant again, and this time she felt more prepared, more confident in her ability to handle whatever came. Their second son, Orrin, was born on a warm summer evening, and he was a calm, easy baby who seemed content to simply observe the world around him with wide, thoughtful eyes. 3 children felt like a full house, felt like more than enough, and Julia and Benjamin agreed that they were happy with their family as it was. Teresa grew into a spirited, independent child who was happiest when she was outside helping her father with the horses, and Gideon was a sweet-natured boy who loved to follow his older sister around and try to keep up with her adventures. Orrin was quieter, more introspective, but he had a smile that could light up a room, and Julia delighted in watching the 3 of them interact, in seeing the bonds of sibling affection form and strengthen. By the time Teresa was 6, Benjamin had saved enough to buy the land they had been renting from Julia's father, and the deed to their property felt like a tangible symbol of everything they had achieved. They were no longer just surviving, they were thriving, building something that would last, something they could pass down to their children. Thomas had grown older, his hair fully silver now, his step a little slower, and he began to talk about handing over more of the ranch's management to Julia and Benjamin. It was a natural transition, and Julia found herself spending more time at her childhood home, helping her mother with the books, working with Benjamin to make decisions about the herd and the land. Margaret had softened over the years, had grown genuinely fond of Benjamin and doted on her grandchildren with a warmth she had not shown when Julia was growing up. Watching her mother play with Teresa and Gideon and Orrin, Julia felt a sense of completeness, a sense that the circle had closed in the best possible way. One evening in late autumn, when the children were finally asleep and the house was quiet, Julia sat with Benjamin on the porch and looked out over the land they had worked so hard to build. The cabin had grown into a proper house now, with multiple rooms and a real roof and windows that did not rattle in the wind. The fences were straight and strong, the barn was full of good horses and healthy cattle, and in the distance she could see the lights of her parents' house glowing warmly against the darkening sky. "You remember that day Marcus came back?" she asked suddenly, and Benjamin turned to look at her with surprise. They rarely talked about Marcus anymore. He was a figure from a past life, irrelevant to the present they had built. "I remember," Benjamin said quietly. "I remember thinking I was going to lose you, that you would choose him, and I would have to watch you go." Julia reached over and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his the way she had that first day by the fence. "I was never going to choose him," she said softly. "Even before I fully understood what I felt for you, I knew I did not want him. But seeing him ride up that day, seeing him ask for another chance, it forced me to be honest with myself about what I really wanted. And what I wanted was you, Benjamin. What I wanted was this life, this messy, hard, beautiful life we have built together. I would not trade it for anything, not for all the comfort and status in the world." Benjamin lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, just as he had that first night on this very porch, and his eyes were bright with emotion. "You gave me everything I ever wanted," he said, his voice rough. "A home, a family, a purpose. I wake up every morning grateful that you chose me, that you took a chance on a drifter with nothing to his name but a good horse and a lot of hope." Julia felt tears sting her eyes, and she laughed through them, shaking her head. "You were never just a drifter, Benjamin. You were always so much more than that. I just had to be smart enough to see it." They sat together in the gathering dark, hand in hand, listening to the sounds of the night settling around them. Inside the house, their children slept peacefully, safe and loved, and Julia thought about the future, about the years still ahead of them, the challenges they would face and the joys they would share. She thought about Marcus sometimes, wondered if he had found happiness, if he had married some society woman and built the respectable life he had wanted. She hoped he had learned from his mistakes the way she had learned from hers. But mostly she did not think about him at all, because her life was too full, too rich, too demanding of her attention to spare much for what might have been. She had made her choice that day by the fence, and every day since had been a confirmation of the rightness of that choice. She had chosen laughter over propriety, partnership over comfort, love over security, and it had given her a life beyond anything she could have imagined. The seasons turned as they always did, and the children grew as children do. Teresa became a skilled rider, fearless and competent, and Julia watched her daughter work with the horses and saw herself at that age, saw the same independence and determination. Gideon was quieter but no less capable, and he had a gift for working with animals that reminded Julia of Benjamin, a natural ease and patience that made even the most skittish creatures trust him. Orrin remained thoughtful and observant, a child who seemed to see more than he said, who could sit for hours watching the world around him with those serious eyes. Julia and Benjamin taught them to work hard, to value honesty and kindness, to understand that what mattered was not what you had but who you were and how you treated others. It was the same lesson Julia's father had taught her, the same values that had guided her when she made the choice to refuse Marcus and choose Benjamin, and she hoped her children would carry those lessons forward into their own lives. Thomas passed away peacefully in his sleep when Teresa was 10, and his death left a hole in all their lives. He had been a steady, reassuring presence, a man who led by example, and who had welcomed Benjamin into the family with open arms. The ranch felt different without him, quieter, and Julia grieved not just for her father, but for the loss her children would feel, growing up without his guidance. But Margaret was still there, still strong despite her grief, and she threw herself into helping Julia and Benjamin manage the expanded operation, the combined lands that now stretched across miles of Oregon hillside. They renamed it the Ashford Shaw Ranch, a merging of both families, both legacies, and Julia felt her father's approval in the way the land responded to their care, in the way the herds thrived and the horses found good homes. Margaret lived for another 15 years, long enough to see her grandchildren grow into capable young adults, long enough to tell Julia more than once that she had been right, that choosing Benjamin had been the right decision, the brave decision, the decision that had led to a life of true happiness. When Margaret finally passed, Julia felt the weight of being the matriarch, of being the oldest generation now, and it was a strange, bittersweet feeling. But she had Benjamin beside her, still as strong and steady as he had been that day by the fence, and she had her children, and by then she had grandchildren too, Teresa having married a good man from a neighboring ranch and started a family of her own. The cycle continued, generations building on what had come before, and Julia felt the satisfaction of knowing that the choice she had made all those years ago had rippled outward, creating lives and futures that would not have existed otherwise. She and Benjamin grew old together, their hair turning gray, their bodies slowing down, but the love between them never wavered. If anything, it deepened, became richer and more complex, layered with decades of shared experience and mutual support. On their 40th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a party at the ranch, and the house was full of family and friends, laughter and music spilling out into the autumn evening. Julia stood on the porch with Benjamin, watching their grandchildren run through the yard, and she felt a contentment so profound, it brought tears to her eyes. "What are you thinking?" Benjamin asked, his arm around her shoulders, and Julia leaned into him, breathing in the familiar scent of him, leather and wood smoke and home. "I am thinking about that fence," she said, and Benjamin laughed, a warm, rumbling sound that she had loved for 40 years. "The fence we were painting when Marcus showed up," he asked, and Julia nodded. "That fence," she confirmed. "I am thinking about how scared I was, seeing him ride up, worried that everything I had been feeling for you was going to get complicated, worried that I would have to make some terrible choice. But then, I realized it was not complicated at all. It was the simplest thing in the world. I loved you, and I wanted to stay right there, painting that fence, laughing with you. And that is what I have done, Benjamin. For 40 years I have stayed right here, building this life with you, and I would not change a single thing." Benjamin pulled her closer, and they stood together watching the sun set over the land they had spent a lifetime tending. And Julia felt the circle close, felt the story come full round to its ending. Not an ending marked by tragedy or loss, but an ending marked by fulfillment, by love sustained and deepened over time, by a choice made in a moment of clarity that had shaped every moment that came after. She had been painting a fence, laughing, when her ex returned wanting a second chance, and she had been brave enough to choose laughter, to choose love, to choose the life that made her happy over the life that made sense. And that choice had given her everything. She looked up at Benjamin, at the lines time had etched into his face, at the hazel eyes that still looked at her with the same wonder and adoration they had held that first day. And she smiled. "I love you," she said simply, and he smiled back, that easy, warm smile that had captured her heart all those years ago. "I love you too," he said. "Always have, always will." The party continued inside, the sounds of celebration floating out into the cool evening air, and Julia and Benjamin stood together on the porch, hand in hand, watching the stars begin to emerge overhead. Somewhere in the barn, horses nickered softly to one another, and in the distance a coyote called to its pack, and the land stretched out around them, familiar and beloved, a testament to everything they had built together. Julia thought about the girl she had been, standing by that fence with paint on her hands, trying to decide what she wanted from life. She thought about the courage it had taken to refuse Marcus, to claim Benjamin, to choose uncertainty over security. And she thought about all the years that had followed, the hard times and the joyful times, the children raised and the land tended, the love that had sustained them through it all. It had been the right choice. She had known it then, in her bones, and she knew it now, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived. As the evening deepened and the air grew cooler, they finally went inside to rejoin their family, and Julia looked around at the faces gathered in her home, at the children and grandchildren and friends who had come to celebrate with them, and she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. This was what she had chosen when she chose Benjamin. Not just a man, but a life, a family, a legacy. And it was more than enough. It was everything. They danced together, slowly, in the middle of the crowded room, and Julia rested her head against Benjamin's chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart, the same heart that had been hers for 40 years, and she closed her eyes and let herself simply be in the moment, savoring the sweetness of it. When the party finally wound down and the guests began to leave, Benjamin and Julia stood on the porch again, waving goodbye, and then they were alone, just the two of them in the quiet house, and it felt right, felt perfect, felt like coming home. "Let's go look at that fence," Benjamin said suddenly, and Julia looked at him in surprise. "Now, in the dark?" she asked, and he grinned at her, boyish and mischievous even at his age. "Why not? We have a lamp, come on." He took her hand and led her out into the night, grabbing a lantern from the barn as they passed, and they walked together across the property to the old fence line where it had all begun. The fence had been repaired and repainted many times over the years, but it was still there, still standing, still marking the boundary of their land. Benjamin held up the lantern, and in its golden light Julia could see the white boards gleaming, and she laughed, remembering that long-ago afternoon when everything had changed. "We did good work," Benjamin said, running his hand along the top rail, and Julia nodded, understanding that he was talking about more than just the fence. "We did," she agreed softly. "We did very good work." They stood there for a while, holding hands, looking at the fence and the land beyond it, and Julia felt the presence of all the years they had lived, all the choices that had brought them to this moment. The fence was just a fence, but it was also a symbol, a reminder of the day she had chosen love over expectation, laughter over propriety, the life that made her happy over the life that made sense. And standing here now, with Benjamin beside her and 40 years of shared history behind them, Julia knew that she would make the same choice again, every single time. The wind rustled through the grass, carrying with it the scent of sage and pine, and somewhere in the distance an owl hooted, and the night was alive with the sounds and smells of the land they loved. Julia squeezed Benjamin's hand and he looked down at her, and even in the dim light of the lantern she could see the love in his eyes, unchanged by time, constant as the stars overhead. "Let's go home," she said finally, and Benjamin nodded, and they turned together and walked back toward the house, their shadows long in the lamplight, their steps in sync after a lifetime of walking side by side. The house glowed warm and welcoming as they approached, and Julia felt a surge of love for this place, for this life, for this man who had given her everything she had never known she needed. They went inside and banked the fire and climbed into bed together, and Benjamin wrapped his arms around her, and Julia settled against him with a sigh of contentment. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness, and Benjamin kissed the top of her head. "For what?" he asked, and Julia smiled. "For everything. For seeing me, for loving me, for building this life with me, for being exactly who you are." She felt Benjamin's chest rumble with quiet laughter. "I should be thanking you," he said. "You took a chance on a ranch hand with nothing but hope and a good horse. You gave me a family, a home, a reason to work harder than I ever thought I could. You gave me everything, Julia." They lay together in the comfortable silence of two people who did not need words to communicate, who could speak volumes with a touch or a sigh, and Julia felt herself drifting toward sleep, safe and loved and profoundly content. This was the happily ever after, she thought drowsily. Not some fairy tale ending where everything was perfect and easy, but this real, lived in happiness, built on work and compromise and decades of choosing each other every single day. This was what she had been painting toward that afternoon when Marcus had ridden up wanting a second chance. This fullness, this completeness, this sense of being exactly where she was meant to be. She had been busy painting the cowboy's fence, laughing, and she had been too smart to give up that laughter for anything else. And it had been the best decision of her life. In the morning, Julia woke to find Benjamin already up, and she could smell coffee brewing and hear him moving around in the kitchen. She lay in bed for a moment longer, savoring the warmth of the quilts, the familiar sounds of her home, the knowledge that another day stretched ahead of them, another day of this life they had built together. Eventually, she rose and dressed and went to join him, and they sat at the kitchen table with their coffee and watched the sun rise over the hills, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. It was a scene they had witnessed thousands of times, but it never grew old, never lost its beauty, and Julia felt grateful for every single one of those mornings, for every day she had been given with this man in this place, living this life. "What do you want to do today?" Benjamin asked, and Julia considered. They were old now, their working days mostly behind them, their children and grandchildren managing the ranch, but there was still plenty to occupy them, still work to be done, still life to be lived. "I think I would like to go for a ride," she said finally. "Out to the east pasture where we can see the whole valley, just the two of us." Benjamin smiled at her, and she saw approval and affection in his eyes. "That sounds perfect," he said. "I will saddle the horses." They rode out later that morning, taking their time, enjoying the feel of the sun on their faces and the gentle movement of the horses beneath them. The land spread out around them in all its autumn glory, and Julia looked at it with the eyes of someone who had known every inch of it for decades, who had watched it change with the seasons, who had poured her heart and soul into caring for it. When they reached the high point of the east pasture, they stopped and dismounted, and they stood together looking out over the valley, and Julia felt a peace so deep it was almost transcendent. "I have been thinking," Benjamin said after a while, and Julia turned to look at him. "About what?" she asked, and he smiled a little sheepish. "About that fence, about how everything changed that day. I was so afraid when your ex showed up. I thought I had lost you before I even really had you. But you chose me, Julia. You chose me, and you have kept choosing me every day since, and I just want you to know that I see that. I appreciate it. I never take it for granted." Julia felt her throat tighten with emotion, and she reached out and took his hand. "I chose you because you made me happy," she said simply. "Because being with you felt like coming home. And that has never changed, Benjamin, not in 40 years. You still make me happy. You still make me laugh. You are still the person I want beside me through everything." They stood together on that hilltop, hand in hand, and Julia thought about the arc of their life together. The way it had started with paint and laughter, and a choice made in a moment of clarity. She thought about all the moments that had followed, the triumphs and the struggles, the children raised and the land tended, the quiet accumulation of days that had added up to a lifetime. And she thought about how none of it would have happened if she had not been brave enough to turn away from what was expected and reach for what she wanted. Marcus had offered her security and status, a life that looked good on paper, and she had refused him because she knew that those things were not enough. She had wanted love, partnership, laughter, and she had found all of that with Benjamin. She had found a life that was messy and hard and beautiful, a life that challenged her and fulfilled her, a life that made her grateful every single day. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had chosen differently?" Benjamin asked quietly, and Julia shook her head immediately. "No," she said firmly. "Never. I know exactly what would have happened. I would have been comfortable and miserable, married to a man I did not truly love, living a life that looked right but felt wrong. And I would have missed out on all of this, on you and our children and this beautiful life we have built. I would have missed out on everything that matters, Benjamin. So no, I never wonder. I know I made the right choice." She saw relief flash across his face, saw him let go of some fear he had been carrying, and she realized that even after all these years, even after 4 decades of marriage and a house full of evidence of their love, he had still harbored some small doubt, some worry that she might regret her choice. It made her love him even more, made her want to reassure him, to make sure he understood. "You are my great love," she said, and her voice was strong and clear. "You are the person I was meant to find, meant to build a life with." When I was standing by that fence and Marcus rode up, I knew in that instant that what I felt for you was more real, more important, than anything I had ever felt for him. It was not even a hard choice, Benjamin. It was the easiest choice I have ever made, because all I had to do was choose what made me happy, and you made me happy. You still make me happy. You always will." Benjamin pulled her into his arms then, holding her tightly, and Julia felt the strength of his embrace, felt the love and gratitude he could not quite put into words, and she held him back just as tightly, pouring all her own love and certainty into the gesture. They stood like that for a long time, 2 old people on a hilltop, holding each other against the vastness of the sky, and it was perfect, it was everything. It was the culmination of a lifetime of love and work and choosing each other, day after day after day. When they finally pulled apart, they mounted their horses and rode slowly back toward the house, and Julia looked at the land around them, at the fences and the barns and the house in the distance, and she felt a profound sense of ownership, not in the legal sense but in the deeper sense of belonging. This was her land, her home, her life, built with her own hands and the hands of the man she loved. This was what she had chosen when she chose Benjamin, when she chose laughter over expectation, when she chose to keep painting that fence instead of riding away with Marcus. And it had been worth it. Every struggle, every hardship, every moment of doubt or fear had been worth it, because it had led to this, to a life rich with love and meaning and connection. That evening, as the sun set once more over the Oregon hills, Julia and Benjamin sat together on their porch, and their children came to visit, bringing the grandchildren with them, and the house filled once more with noise and laughter, and the beautiful chaos of family. Julia watched Teresa help one of her sons with his homework, watched Gideon teach his daughter how to properly braid a rope, watched Orrin sit quietly with his youngest child, reading a story in the lamplight. She saw herself and Benjamin in all of them, saw the values they had tried to instill, the love they had modeled, and she felt a fierce pride in what they had created, not just the physical ranch but this family, this legacy of love and hard work and choosing happiness over convenience. When the children finally left and the house was quiet again, Benjamin looked at Julia and smiled, and she smiled back, and no words were necessary. They had said everything that mattered, had lived everything that mattered, and what remained was simply this: the quiet companionship of two people who had chosen each other and had never once regretted it. Julia lived to be 83 years old, and Benjamin lived to be 85, and in all those years they never spent a night apart unless absolutely necessary. They grew old together, their bodies failing slowly but their love never wavering, and when Julia finally passed away peacefully in her sleep with Benjamin holding her hand, she went with a smile on her face, content in the knowledge that she had lived a good life, a full life, a life worth living. And Benjamin, when his own time came 2 years later, went knowing that he would see her again, that whatever came next, they would face it together, just as they had faced everything else. Their children buried them side by side on the hill overlooking the valley, and they planted wildflowers on the graves, the same kind of wildflowers Benjamin had picked for Julia all those years ago when he was courting her. And the ranch continued, passed down to the next generation, and the next, a living testament to the choice Julia made that day by the fence, the choice to laugh instead of cry, to reach for joy instead of security, to choose the life that made her happy over the life that made sense. Years later, when Teresa was an old woman herself, she would tell her own grandchildren the story of how their great-grandmother had refused a second chance with a rich man, because she was too busy painting a fence with a cowboy, too busy laughing to care about what she was supposed to want. And she would tell them that this choice, this simple, brave choice, had created all of them, had created the family and the ranch, and the legacy they now enjoyed. She would tell them that love was not about what looked good on paper, but about what made your heart sing, about finding someone who made you laugh and then choosing to keep laughing with them, day after day, year after year, for a whole lifetime. And she would tell them that her mother had been the happiest woman she had ever known, because she had been brave enough to choose happiness when it was offered, brave enough to paint the fence and laugh and build a life that mattered. And in telling that story, Teresa would keep alive the memory of Julia and Benjamin, of their great love and their brave choices, and the wildflowers on the hill would bloom year after year, bright and beautiful, a reminder that some choices echo forward through generations, creating ripples of love and joy that never truly end.